This is presentation PowerPoint 1.4 on agricultural developments in the late 19th century. Now, as I've done before, I just want you to walk away from this with a few basic, simple principles that we can expand and deal with and understand two things. One, what agricultural developments took place, and two, what contribution these developments make to the economic crisis that happens in the 1890s, which actually will be one of the leading causes of the progressive movement of the early 20th century. Okay, so they're all connected together, and we need to understand how they're all connected together. Now, to start off with, let's just have a real basic, simple economics lesson on what's known as the terms of trade. Terms of trade, as you see there, is very simple. Money in versus money out. This necessitates our thinking about where does the money in come from, where does the money out go to. Well, let's think of the agricultural sector, the farmers. Well, money in, obviously, comes from the sale of their product, comes from the sale of their crop. Okay, money out goes to the purchase of all of the inputs to their crop, plus any other manufactured goods that they might want to purchase. Okay, now let's stick that in the back of our minds and keep that in mind. We'll rejoin it again later, but let's just remember that for now. Now, let's look at the history, very briefly, of farming through the history of the United States to date, up to about, a little past the Civil War. Okay, in the colonial period, the southern colonies all produced cash crops, primarily tobacco, also rice and indigo. Because they produced cash crops, even in a mercantile system, at the time of the American Revolution, they had a positive balance of trade. So their terms of trade were positive. Their money in exceeded their money out, and so they were profiting. Now, New England, on the other hand, their money in, they didn't have any cash crops, and they were prohibited from developing a manufacturing sector because of the Navigation Acts. And so their money in was much less than their money out, and so they were running a debt. The middle colonies, like Pennsylvania, were about breaking even. Their principal source of money in was the shipping industry. In fact, by the time of the American Revolution, virtually all shipping in Britain was produced in the United States. Their money out, of course, was purchasing manufactured goods. Okay, so the southern colonies were making money, and in fact, in U.S. History 1, this is one of the points we stress because the southern colonies were kind of lukewarm on the revolution to begin with, and that's why ultimately Clinton, the general in charge of the British operation in 1778, makes what ends up being a kind of a strategic error instead of pursuing Washington in the north, he switches strategies and creates an offensive in the south, which doesn't go well. It ultimately will lead to Cornwallis' surrender at Yorktown. And so what do we see from this in the terms of the term of trade? Well, if the price of the farm commodities goes up, while the price of manufacturing goods goes down, the terms of trade improve, and vice versa. And we have this also in U.S. History 1 as ultimately the cause of the economic crisis in 1819 and the economic crisis in 1837, although there are a few other things there that are a bit tangential to our current presentation. Okay, and so the effect on the banking system is when the farmers' terms of trade go bad. They go into debt. To cover that debt, they borrow from the banks. That puts strain on the banking sector's ability to lend out money. Okay, so again, we want to keep that in the back of our minds as we go through this. Now we start to talk about, in terms of the terms of trade, both money in and money out for the farmers. First, just a kind of a brief history of trade policy in the United States. And I mentioned it once before in one of the earlier presentations. From 1807 until roughly the end of the Second World War is what would be referred to as the protectionist era in the United States, meaning that you have high tariffs and limitations to trade in the United States. Not really limitations to trade. You have trade restrictions in the United States, primarily tariffs. A tariff, for those of us playing at home that don't know, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. Okay? The reason for doing this is twofold. One, you raise government revenue up until really the time of the Civil War, and even after that, until really the introduction of the income tax in the 20th century. One of the primary sources, in fact, up to the Civil War, the primary source of government revenue were land sales and revenues from tariffs. Okay. The second thing is to cultivate manufacturing. If we tariff foreign products, that increases their price. That allows our own producers to produce at a higher price and still have a competitive advantage against foreign goods. That protects the manufacturing sector. Okay? Now, the result of this, however, and this is pretty much the orthodox economics cut on tariffs, and you'll see it in any economics textbook you care to look at, is that you're going to have an inflated price for manufactured goods. Okay? In other words, if a foreign good can trade for $1, but the Americans can't produce it for $1, American cost of production, let's say, is $1.80. Okay, we charge $1 tariff or $1.50 tariff. Now the foreign product is costing $2.50, and the American producer can charge up to $2.50, say $2.49, and still have a competitive advantage. Well, that's going to have the net effect of increasing the price of all goods across the board. The result of this, of course, in our discussion of terms of trade, you have money in and money out. Well, this is money out. That means money out is going to go up. All right? We talked about the strain on the banking system. Now what we want to think about is where that strain is coming from. One, what we're ultimately developing here is an understanding of how, by the end of the 19th century, and that last third of the 19th century, the farming sector is accumulating a massive debt. Okay? Well, this is going to be another explanation. We have protectionist trade barriers that artificially raise the price of manufactured goods. Now we have massive land expansion. Okay, we have the Indian Removal Act in 1830 that pushes the Indians west of the Mississippi and frees up all that land for purchase. We have the Homestead Act of 1862. Now, the Homestead Act of 1862 gave 160 acres of free land to anyone willing to cultivate it, but it charged an annual fee, which was the introduction of property tax in the United States, and in order to cultivate the land, you need capital equipment. For that capital equipment, you borrow money from a bank. Okay? Then we have westward migration. We don't just simply have the annexation of Texas, but we have the Mexican Cession of 1848, which frees up the entire American Southwest. Again, you have land purchase. And so people are buying land hand over fist. How are they buying land? Well, they're buying land by borrowing money from the bank. They're then borrowing more money from the bank to buy the capital equipment necessary and the inputs necessary to develop the land. Okay, so again, we're placing a strain on the banking sector. Then finally, we have the production increase in cotton. Okay, Texas will ultimately become the largest cotton producing state. Well, to expand production of cotton, you're going to need more cotton gins, you're going to need more land, you're going to need all of the inputs for cotton production. Where are you going to get these? You're going to borrow money from the bank to get it. Okay, now we could parenthetically add to this the idea that Andrew Jackson, as much as I love the guy because he was a very, very colorful character, really screwed the pooch economically. He had no understanding of economics at all. And so when he introduces both the specie circular and the independent treasury system, it screws the farmers because the specie circular says that all land purchases have to be done in gold and silver, where there's a much more limited supply of gold and silver, and so that's going to jack up interest rates for land purchases. Okay? And secondly, all U.S. government gold and silver is going to be held in the independent treasury system and not released into the system. It's going to be held as backing to the currency. Again, this is going to jack up interest rates. And so again, what do we see? Terms of trade in terms of money out for the farmers is getting precipitously worse. These are land policies enacted, and you see when they're enacted there on the PowerPoint. They're enacted, and this facilitates the expansion of land cultivation and, by way of extension, farming. But by the same token, it increases land purchases, it increases borrowing for capital equipment to cultivate the land, which places an even greater strain on the banking system. And at this point, I'm going to introduce to you what we've done before. Keep in the back of your mind that while this is going on, you're also having a massive, precipitous increase in industrial production. So both sectors are growing at an alarming rate. How are they growing? They're borrowing money from the banks. And so the banks are having a continual liquidity drain on their reserves, which will ultimately, as I've said before, kind of explode in their face in the early 1890s. We see here the results of this land expansion. We go from this is, of course, comes from Alton and Rockoff. We go from 2 million farms to 5.7 million farms, and I'm not going to do the math on that. What is it, about a 100% increase, almost a 200% increase from 1860 to 1900. Total cultivated area more than doubles during that same period of time. Again, to stress the point, that's what I do. I understand. I stress the point over and over and over so that we don't miss it. That means you're massively expanding land, you're massively expanding the cultivation thereof. All that's going to be financed by lending. Okay, or by borrowing, I guess is a more accurate way of saying it, but by lending and borrowing. They're two sides of the same coin, I guess. Now, what does that do? I'm back to the nows. Have you guys noticed that? I'm trying to stop myself. I'm doing a pretty good job right now, but have you guys noticed that? Every bloody slide begins with now. So I'm trying to stop that. I'm doing the best I can with it, right? All right, whatever, okay. As agricultural supply increases, okay, this precipitous land expansion, the precipitous growth in farming, what does that do to farmers' terms of trade? We want to keep in mind all the time what is meant by this terms of trade. What we've seen so far is that as a result of basically two things that we've really gone over, okay, the protectionist trade policies which artificially raise the price of manufactured goods, and concurrently with that, the massive land expansion which placed a strain on the banking supply, forcing interest rates up. And so money out in terms of debt repayment, okay, and in terms of purchase of manufactured goods is going up. Now let's look at what's happening to the farmers with money in. We have two things happening, one of which I really have in this slide, the other I'll just talk about. With the massive land expansion, you have an increase in the supply of farm products. Well, as we know from Economics 101, what happens to the price if you increase the supply like this? Well, you see on the slide here, and let me pull up my laser pointer because I like using it real quickly. Okay, we increase supply from QS1 to QS2. We keep demand the same, and what happens to the price? It drops down from E1 to E2, dropping from price 1 to price 2. What I don't have on this slide, I'm not sure why I don't have it on this slide, I guess I just didn't put it in, is at the same time, primarily due to, you have a very unsteady balance with demand, primarily due to the protectionist trade barriers. Because in response to the protectionist trade barriers, other nations are going to erect protectionist trade barriers against the United States, raising the price of imports from the U.S., among them farm products. They'll protect their own farming sectors. Okay? That means that European demand for American cotton and American farm products is going to drop. So demand is actually going to drop from here downward. Now, demand is going to expand back up because the population of the United States is growing, so you'll have more domestic demand. The price will actually settle around here. So precipitously through the end of the 19th century, farm product prices continually drop. What does that mean? That means less money in. At the same time, money out in terms of repayment of debt, in terms of purchase of manufactured goods, is going up. So less money in, more money out, worsening terms of trade. The result, a greater amount of debt. Okay. I'll replace, that's what I'll do for now. I'll replace the nows with okays now. I'll try not to do either of them. It's driving me up a tree, man, that I do this. But, you know, it happens. It happens. What can I say? Okay. Now, this is all what I've explained over the last time. We see both wholesale and consumer prices for farm products steadily decline from 1870 to 1890, making it difficult for farmers to repay debts. By 1900, wholesale prices of farm products had declined by 36%. Retail prices, which is to say consumer prices, had declined 34%. Simultaneously, now we've talked about the effect of the protectionist trade barriers, the tariffs, artificially raising the price of products. We have the strain on the banking sector increasing interest rates, which makes it harder to pay back debt. We also have another fly in the ointment, okay, another piece to this puzzle. And the other piece to this puzzle is what we've talked about before. We talked about it really in PowerPoint slide 2, which is that as the corporations grow and begin to merge with each other, particularly in horizontal mergers, but also the vertical mergers that we talked about, they're going to begin to engage in price fixing. Okay? This is the ultimate, one of the problems with monopoly is that when you're the only producer of something, you can set an artificially high price that doesn't reflect the actual market value. Well, that's going to mean more money out for the farming sector. Okay? It's going to mean more money out for everyone. That's why ultimately the government's going to intervene against price fixing. They'll ultimately, as pursuant to the Clayton Antitrust Act, they'll set up ultimately during the Great Depression, the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission. But they knew a number of things to try to prevent these unfair business practices, or what they deemed to be unfair business practices. So price fixing is another element of this model. We talked about this already, so I'm not really going to cover this slide very much. It's just another slide for protectionist trade policies designed to raise government revenue and cultivate American manufacturing, contribute steadily to the declining terms of trade. Now, in response to this, the farmers are going to try something, and it will not be terribly successful. And there's reasons for it that we don't really need to get into. I'll touch on them. I'll just briefly state them here, okay? What we saw in the late 19th century with industry was what? We saw the horizontal mergers, we saw the vertical mergers, we saw the integration. We saw the formation of the massive conglomerates like Standard Oil of Ohio or like the United States Steel Corporation. What were they able to do? They were able to artificially raise the price of their products to assure profits. Okay? They were also able to convert that economic power into political power and lobby for trade policies to protect American manufacturing, etc. The farmers are going to try the same thing. They're going to begin in the late 1860s, right after the war between the states, right after the Civil War, with the formation of the Grange movement. And the idea is simple. You're going to try to form the farms into collectives. Not collectives in the communist sense of communal production, but in terms of the purchase of grain and seed at wholesale prices. Okay? If we group our resources together, we can purchase things in bulk. Okay? And therefore get a break in price because we'll get a wholesale price. We're also going to use it to try to get together and determine a price for our product so that we're not in competition for each other. If I produce corn and you produce corn and I know you're charging $2 a dozen, I'll charge $1.80 a dozen. Okay? Now that means everybody will buy my corn, nobody will buy your corn, you'll go into debt. But by doing so, you know, the next corn farmer comes along and he says, oh, well, you're charging $1.80. He's charging $2, you're charging $1.80. I'll charge $1.60. And so on and so forth until before you know it, the market price of it is so artificially low that we can't make enough money to keep ourselves afloat. Okay, it works better if we organize ourselves into a collective and price fix, determine a price for our product. Okay, establishes cooperatives, also group credit. If we band ourselves together as a group, we can get a better interest rate on a larger amount of money. And so, as I say here, it mirrors similar organization efforts in industrial organizations. Okay? Now, the problem with this that I said I'd touch on is industrial products, okay, it has to do, without getting into the technical details of it in economics, it has to do with the elasticity of demand. The more common a product is, generally speaking, the higher its elasticity of demand. Okay? Now, elasticity is a measure of the sensitivity of supply to changes in the price. Okay? And think of it this way. Instead of going at it with a technical discussion of elasticity, think of it this way. The more of us there are producing a particular product, the harder it is for us to prevent one of us from defecting. Okay? This is akin to what we discussed in the last slide on organized labor. Okay? If you have a whole bunch of unskilled laborers willing to do a job, it makes it harder for us to unionize because of scabs. It's the idea is, and it's actually in game theory more than anything else, but it has to do with coalition formation and collective action. Okay? In terms of coalition formation, the danger is always defection. Okay? How do we prevent someone from defecting and not going along with the agreement? If we all get together, all us corn producers, and decide that we're going to charge $2 for a dozen ear of corn, and one of us decides to defect, expands their productive facility and decides to charge $1.80, everybody's going to buy his corn and we're out in the cold. Okay? And so there's a real danger with that. Well, the production of farm products, particularly with land expansion, this is it all connects together. What I want you to be able to see is how this all connects together. Okay? We have this massive land expansion, the increase in the number of farms and the area of cultivated land and the production of farming, which causes that precipitous drop in prices. Okay? Well, all of that means that there's a lot more of us producing farm products. And so as we try to organize ourselves together, it's much harder to keep us collective as a unit. Okay? And so that's why I say this is never going to work very well. Now, ultimately, what they're going to be able to do is convert this into a modest amount of political pressure and get some action from the government, but they won't get actual action that helps from the government until the Great Depression, until the 1930s. In an attempt, kind of concurrently with the formation of the Grange, in an attempt to convert this into political action, they'll start the Greenback movement. Now, again, to avoid as much as possible the technical discussion of that, what did we say before? Okay, all of this land expansion, all of this cultivation expansion, coupled with the industrial expansion, okay, the farm increases, all means that the worsening terms of trade for the farmers, all means that you're placing a strain on the banking sector, particularly with the specie circular, which by the late 19th century had been done away with. But you're still on a gold standard. And we'll deal with that at length at the Great Depression. Suffice to say now that the gold standard is the idea that paper currency is transferable to gold and silver. We're on a bimetallic standard at this point. You can translate it to gold and silver, which means that your supply of money is going to be limited by your supply of gold and silver. Okay? You can't just print out more paper money. Okay? It's limited by the supply of gold and silver. Why is this the case? Just a real quick explanation of this. Okay? Let's say that we have 1 ounce of gold, and that we determine that that 1 ounce of gold is worth $10. We then issue $10 in paper currency. The person to whom we release that can at any point in time come in and exchange that $10 paper note for the $10 ounce of gold. All well and good. What we'll do, because of probability, okay, we'll issue additional $10 notes on that same piece of gold. Why? Because we are gambling. Okay? We are betting that at no point in time will everyone come in at the same time to exchange their $10 paper dollars, their $10 paper note, for that 1 ounce of gold. Okay? So we might issue a second one. We might issue a third one, so that we have $30 in paper currency out there, all for the same 1 ounce piece of gold. Okay? Now, what happens? What happens if all of them come in at the same time to exchange their paper currency for that 1 ounce of gold? Well, in that case, we can only give them 1/3 the value. Each of them will get 1/3 an ounce of gold. We'll split that 1 ounce gold coin into 3 pieces and give each of them a third. And so they'll basically lose 2/3 of their money. The more we issue out, the more that danger is. And so we limit it. By the time of the Great Depression, the Federal Reserve System is limited to 2.5 times the amount of gold in the system. in issuance of paper currency. Well, now, back to this. That's just a brief economic lesson in the gold standard. Now we get back to this now we look at this greenback movement, okay? What the farmers were arguing was increase the supply of paper currency relative to the amount of gold and silver. For reasons that I just talked about, that's a very dangerous thing to do. In point of fact, that's how the banking system is based today. It's not based on the gold standard. The United States is not at all based on the gold standard. You can't go into a bank and exchange your money for gold, okay? But what it's based on is the reserve requirement, okay? When you take money to a bank today and deposit it, the bank doesn't keep it in a shelf in the back. They lend it out to people, okay? Well, they have to keep a certain percentage of that on hand, so that if a depositor comes in and wants some of their cash to go buy, an ice cream cone or a cheese Danish somewhere, they can give them the money, okay? Although they wouldn't buy an ice cream cone or a cheese Danish with currency. There's very few things that you have to pay currency for. Drugs is about the only thing. So let's say if somebody comes in and they decide that they just absolutely have to have a resupply of crystal meth and they need cash for it, they need depositors' money for the crystal meth. That's a great example, actually. That's why, okay, and there's, but at any rate. So the idea is let's increase well, that's a dangerous thing to do. The more you increase the supply of paper currency, the more likely it is that more customers are going to come in. That's going to put a strain on your gold and silver supplies. Now, it's relieved a little bit because really from the 1850s onwards, there are as land expands westward, we have some new gold and new silver discoveries. We have the Colorado lode of silver. We have the California gold lode. Some of the Mexican cession produces some gold and silver, but still you're extremely limited. Okay? Well, the greenback movement is going to become translated into a virtual political party, basically known as the Greenback Party or the Green Party. They will eventually be co-opted into the Populist Party and be part of the progressive movement, which advocates a more liberal monetary policy, a more open monetary policy. They also are going to try to advocate, again unsuccessfully, for the sub-treasury plan. The sub-treasury plan is based on the idea, and they'll actually implement this, but not at this time. They'll implement this in the 1920s and much more so in the 1930s. The problem is this. We've massively increased the supply of farm products. We saw the effect of that in a previous slide. It increased the supply of farm products, which created a downward pressure on prices, dropping prices below the rate where we could make any money off of it. Okay? So what we're going to do is withhold farm products from the market. Okay? We'll keep them in a warehouse and reduce the supply of them. Then we will trickle them out bit by bit, paying attention to the price and making sure it doesn't drop too much. Okay? What the government's actually going to do in the 1930s is purchase surplus farm production and destroy it. Okay? This is particularly true in the dairy industry. The dairy industry in the late 1920s and 1930s is overproducing. Okay? As a result, the price of dairy products is dropping to the point where the farmers can't pay their debt. They're just not making enough money. So the national government will come in, the agricultural administration will come in, purchase the dairy products, purchase the milk, and dump it down sewers. Okay? Now, in addition, this is the attempt, and I talked about the difficulties in creating a cartel when you have a very common product. Okay? In addition, the Treasury Department itself, not banks, the Treasury Department itself will lend out 80% the value of commodities at a 2% interest rate. There is absolutely no support for this in the government. Okay? That puts a strain not so much on the banking sector as on the Treasury Department itself, which they won't do. Okay? And there you see the footnote on cooperative action and the problem of defection, which I talked about earlier. Government action. Prior to World War I, government assistance was designed to disseminate information and to individual farmers and to increase productivity. It was not intended to help with debt relief. through government policy, government action, government bailouts, all that stuff, that purchase of the dairy products, all the government subsidies, the farm supports that we have nowadays, that won't come at this period. It will be largely as a result of this period and the Great Depression, that the government will come on board with that. Because, and I know there's an arguments weigh in both ways with this, and we'll deal with it a little bit more when we get to the Great Depression, that whether or not you should support the farming sector. Remember this when it comes to whether or not we should support the farming sector. Even to this day, people don't understand this. When people think of the United States, I talk to foreign students about this all the time. Foreign students come to the United States and they visit the U.S., and that's great. We're glad to have them. And I say, where do you go? And they say, oh, we went to New York. I went to Florida. I went to Miami. I went to Boston. I went to Chicago, wherever. That's not the United States. That's not the majority of the United States. The urban centers, the megalopolis of the East Coast, is not the majority of the United States. If you want to experience the United States, drive yourself from New York City to California. What people note that aren't used to it, is the massive amount of open land in the United States. Okay? That's all farmland. To this day, the principal holders of notes are farmers. They're the ones who hold the principal, the thrust of mortgages and borrowed money. If they can't pay that back, the U.S. banking system is screwed. This is ultimately going to be a contributory cause of the Great Depression. And so the government will, in the Great Depression and henceforward, do things and engage in actions to support the farming sector. What they're actually doing is supporting the banking sector. They're making it possible for the farmers to pay back their bank debt. Okay? And that was well, you know what? I'm going to hold off. We're going to deal with that much later in the current Epoch 3. So we're going to leave that alone for now. Government action 2. We're going to have the Agricultural Division of the Patent Office established in 1839. The Department of Agriculture will be established in 1862. We saw in the last slide, we just reiterate here, what the basic functions of government are in agriculture. Now, conclusion, what do we see from all this? Okay, well, we reference back to Lecture 2 and what we've talked about already in this. We have the massive expansion of industry. Okay? That means borrowed money. As a result of that expansion, what are we going to have? We're going to have the formation of horizontal conglomerates, vertical conglomerates, natural monopolies. All of this is going to raise the price of the product. Okay? They're going to engage in price fixing. That's going to create an artificially high price for the product. In addition, to protect that manufacturing growth, the United States government is going to erect protectionist trade barriers that are going to tax foreign imports. That's going to artificially raise the price still further. That all means greater amounts of money out for the agricultural sector. Okay? At the same time, we have massive expansions in the agricultural sector, the movement westward, the westward migration. We have this financed by bank loans, and so we have this strain on the banking sector as a result of both the manufacturing sector and the agricultural sector borrowing money. We have ever-increasing interest rates. This places the farmers greater in debt, makes it more difficult for them to pay back their debt, and so again, money out goes up. Now, in terms of the money in, we have this gradual decline in prices that we saw in that one slide. What did it say? 36% drop in wholesale prices, 34% drop in retail prices. The formation of collectives really didn't work very well to correct for that. And so all of that is going to be one of the precipitory causes, the main precipitory causes of the economic crisis and depression of 1893, which we'll ultimately get to at the end of this epoch.